Very good. Thank you, Sally, and hello to everybody. I wish I could be there with you in person. I'm currently at a studio in Brooklyn recording an audiobook, which is a longstanding commitment I had today, but I'm very glad to be able to join y'all by Zoom and speak briefly with you and make time for questions as well on the subject of parapsychology, which is the academic science of studying extra physicality, very often associated with studying ESP, clairvoyance, telepathy, reincarnation, after death survival, uh, any kind of subject that suggests that the human experience is not limited strictly to flesh and bone and motor skill. We have a sort of materialist or strict physicalist philosophy in Western culture that holds that the mind, whatever that may be, is an epiphenomena of the brain, almost like bubbles in a carbonated glass of water. And um, when the mind disappears, or at the time of physical death, the bubbles disappear, and that's that. But parapsychology, over close to a century running now, has provided us with detailed, repeated, and really impeccable scientific data that demonstrates some anomalous capacity to send and receive information in a lab setting that goes beyond the traditional five senses. We are able, in a way that is demonstrably real as the words I'm speaking to you right now, although theoretically unclear, able to receive and transfer information in what appears to be a mind to mind capacity. In other words, the sending and receiving of information in a manner that not only supersedes the traditional five senses that we know, taste, touch, sight, hearing, and so on, but that also is able to function within this field of information, this field of exchange in a way that bends common observation of time, space, mass. And I think we live at an exciting time, and I don't say that lightly, and I wouldn't have said that 5 years ago. I think we live in an exciting time because we as a human community are receiving validation of what I've just described from people and sources within the scientific culture that haven't gone looking for it. And I often say that evidence unsought is evidence most convincing. Some of you may have read in the news in December of 2024 that Google engineers felt that they had accomplished a breakthrough with a quantum computing prototype that they're developing, which has not yet been released to the public, called Willow. And the engineers reported that Willow was given a math problem to solve that was so complicated that it was estimated to require 10 septillion years to solve. That's a 10 followed by 25 zeros. It's an inconceivably large number. It's a number that is larger than the known and projected existence of the universe. So such a math problem is impossible to solve according to our standard conceptions of time. Willow came up with a correct answer in under less than 5 minutes, or so the engineers reported. And in the statement that Google issued, the engineers made the point, almost in this gloriously quotidian way, not trying to unlock secrets of the universe, not trying to make any big mystical or metaphysical points. The engineers made the point that because this answer arrived in a way that superseded the known existence of time itself, as measured by the existence of our universe, it provided evidence for what is sometimes called a multiverse, or different dimensions of reality. And the thinking I'm extrapolating a little here, but I think I'm being perfectly faithful to what their statement indicated. The thinking went that Willow might have plucked the answer, so to speak, from another intersection of time or another dimension of reality. Since there isn't enough time in creation for Willow to have arrived at the answer, but the answer came and the impossible occurred, the answer may have been plucked where it exists along some other timeline of reality. This is also what is sometimes called string theory. It's sometimes called many worlds theory. The term that the Google engineers used was multiverse. And when I read things like that, it's very exciting to me because these are not people working in parapsychology per se. These are not people working to provide a mystical or a metaphysical view of life. They're just trying to create the world's fastest computer, but in so doing, they find that reality as we know it is bending. And this is the kind of work that's been going on in parapsychology for pretty close to a century. And it is work that has been performed, including by some of the people that Sally has worked with herself, and she has worked with some of the true greats in this field. She has worked with people in this field who I view as the parapsychological equivalent of Albert Einstein. And some of the people that with whom Sally has worked over the years have produced evidence for ESP or clairvoyance or telepathy that is as airtight, certain, and replicable and bulletproof as anything to come out of the Google computational labs. And they're reaching similar conclusions, which is that we as a human species are unbound by time and space in the way that we've been traditionally raised to see such things. Parapsychology has also resulted in tremendous pushback. If you go on Wikipedia tonight, for example, and you look into any of the statements that I've made, you will come away thinking that you want your money back, for this class. That Horowitz is just making things up. This is complete nonsense. There is an apparatus of professional skepticism that has very successfully spiked this information, created confusion in the public mind, and on Wikipedia in particular, which at the moment still remains the central reference source worldwide. Most of the articles on parapsychology and most of the articles on the subjects that I have been referencing are spiked by activist critics who feel profound anathema towards what I am describing. I'm not sure I fully understand why, and as much as I, like any of us, I suppose, try to consider myself a student of human nature, I don't fully understand the reason for the rejection of this material. But I'm getting closer, I think, to appreciating the reasons why career or professional skeptics, activist skeptics, react with such violent displeasure at the airing of this material, and indeed in media, in reference sources, sometimes within academia itself, will provide a degree of pushback that really confuses the public as to the verity and the replicability of this data. I think they are unable to receive what I'm describing. They're unable to receive this data. It's not that they weigh it, they consider it, and they think, no, no, it's wrong, which would be fair. It's that almost on an organic level, they demonstrate incapacity to even see or hear this material. And I think that's a malady that's common to human nature. We define ourselves in certain ways that are so uncompromising, are so certain that if someone comes along and presents us with conflicting data or a conflicting point of view, we don't take it in. It's not that we weigh it, consider it, and reject it or accept it. We literally don't take it in. And I think that's part of what is happening what has happened over the past several generations of parapsychology. I'll give you a very immediate example. I just described to you the Google engineer's statement about Willow's abilities. I encourage you to put the search terms yourself into a Google window or any search engine. Put Google statement on Willow, Willow. Read the statement yourself. See if I've misrepresented it. I trust you'll see that I've represented it very accurately. And yet people have recently pushed back and said, Horowitz is exaggerating this whole thing. It's nonsense. He's misrepresenting it. That's not at all what the engineers said. And they sincerely believe this. They sincerely believe this, even though the statement that the engineers made is as plain as I think I've just paraphrased to you. And yet you can find statements online that will assert with total confidence and apparent sincerity that I've misrepresented it. Why? Why? I used to be very perplexed about this, and I've come to believe quite recently that it just represents a malady in human nature where we, as individuals and as a human community, are incapable of taking in information that conflicts with our basic definition of ourselves. And our definition of ourselves in the Western world is that time is linear, it moves in one direction. There's no such thing as precognition. You know, the idea of objects, including cognitive awareness, moving backwards in time, it's theoretically impossible, it's practically impossible. That ESP, extrasensory perception, telepathy, etc. These things all violate the common laws of physics, and they violate classical laws of physics. They violate laws of physics that were reached by the great Isaac Newton and by the great Albert Einstein, none of whom closed the books on the matter, both of whom were very engaged with some of the metaphysical questions that I've been raising. Now, conventional physics, standard Newtonian physics, does dictate limitations of the sort that Western culture has more or less structured itself on. But the quantum age, quantum mechanics, the age of quantum computing that I've been referencing, which isn't even really upon us just yet, doesn't prohibit any of these things. In fact, the permeability of time space and the ability of the psyche to move among different intersections of time and to receive information in the same way that Willow received its information about the impossible math problem that it was given, we certainly have evidence that we too, as human beings, are able to receive information in a way that violates laws of standard physics, classical physics, but not of quantum mechanics, in which objects um, are in what might be called a state of superposition. In other words, everything everywhere exists all at once until a measurement is taken. And and only when that measurement is taken does something concretize and become real, actual, local, measurable. It's again as real as the words I'm speaking. And yet it violates the principles on which Western civilization has established itself. Rather than saying that the old principles aren't wrong, but they're incomplete, as Einstein said, as certainly Isaac Newton would have said. Rather than saying that, there's a kind of kill the messenger mentality, which is why it's very hard for this information to reach the public. And yet, I'm hopeful today in a way that I certainly was not even just a few years ago, because I think we are on the brink of such extraordinary public interaction with some of these models that it's impossible at a certain point to functionally deny them. Tolstoy made the observation that man, at a certain point, to rescue himself from absurdity, had to acknowledge that the earth moves around the sun rather than the other way around. We're reaching that same kind of point where to rescue ourselves from absurdity, we're going to have to deal with the reality of this data, of this material. Um, I haven't been terribly specific about any of this in terms of individual experiments, just because our time today is so limited. But there is one thing I want to say before I wrap up and open up to any questions or exchange that you all might have. My intellectual hero is a scientist with whom your teacher, Sally Drucker, directly worked, and that is a man named J.B. Rhine. J.B., along with his wife, Louisa Rhine, really effectively started the field of parapsychology as an academic science here in the United States. And JB accomplished something that was just extraordinary. Through simple card tests, which he began starting in the late 1920s up through the early 1930s, these were conducted at his parapsychology lab at Duke University, which still exists as an off campus independent lab, but still affiliated with Duke, or at least cooperative with Duke. Um, JB's card experiments demonstrated that certain individuals were able, uh, through use of a deck called Zener cards, which is a very simple five-suit deck of cards, were able to make so-called guess hits on this five-suit deck of cards, which should have resulted in a 1 out of 5 chance, 20% chance of getting it right. And that certain individuals, um, instead of scoring 1 out of 5 over thousands and thousands of trials, would consistently score higher, 25%, 26, 27, 28%, sometimes higher. So the deviation was not extraordinary. It wasn't like Zeus throwing lightning bolts at Earth, but it was enough over what eventually grew into a case file of a million trials. It was enough to demonstrate that certain individuals had a capacity for, again, gleaning information in ways that were anomalous, in ways that exceeded laws of chance and manners of receipt through our regular five senses. It was JB that really ignited my passion for this field. Very few remarkable things happen to me. We all have our stories of weird coincidences and remarkable dreams, and I certainly have those things, but not in any unusual way. No more than I would say any of you listening to this. Um, so I'm not one who grew up with the idea of doting on fantastic experiences. I don't see Bigfoot. I don't get abducted. Nothing happens to me that's really worth writing home about. But what I learned from JB's simple card tests is that if the entire field of parapsychology had stopped, say in 1935, had stopped with those tests. And for whatever reason, nothing else was ever done. No repetition was ever attempted. We would have sufficient information to demonstrate that the human experience and the human psyche goes beyond just um, flesh and bone, standard cognition and motor skill, and that we are something more than that carbonated water whose bubbles disappear when the mind disappears. And the field, of course, did continue, and findings continued and amassed, and other people with whom Sally has worked um, hit upon data that was, in its way, even more extraordinary than the data that JB laid the foundation uh, for the field to discover. The field has grown. The field has not flourished in the traditional way because the pushback from ideological or career skeptics has been severe, and it has limited funding, even though these experiments are very inexpensive. And yet, truth has a way of reasserting itself. Truth has a way of following a long, long arc of labor to finally find its way to the public mind. And I do believe, again, I wouldn't have said this 5 years ago, but I do believe that that truth is coming out and finding exposure to our generation. So it's an exciting time for this field, and it's exciting for you all to be instructed by someone like Sally Drucker, who has worked with some of the greats in this field. And I am grateful to Sally and to you all for giving me a few minutes this evening to talk with you, and I'd be happy to hear any questions or comments you may have. Thank you.
Mitch, can you hear us?
Yes,
Okay, you can't see us though, right?
I can't see you, but I can hear you.
Right, okay, so then the floor is open to anyone. Oh, you don't. The students felt that you deserve the applause. The floor is open to questions. Does anybody have a question? I always have questions, but really it's your turn tonight.
Hi, Mitch. I have a question. So over the last, you're talking about since 1935, that's some 90 odd years, that there must have been any number of technological advances, that we've had. With an experiment like those xener cards, how have those, 9 decades worth of technological advances influenced the study of what of the effects of those xener card studies? Have they changed over those 90 years?
Well, they have changed insofar as, well, first of all, the technology has certainly changed. Um, there are scientists in this present generation, including Dean Radin and Darrell Bem, who do experiments on precognition using computer imagery. Put simply, both Dean and Darrell have um, determined and have produced widely replicated data showing that if you're in front of a computer screen, for example, and you are presented with images that might be emotionally jarring, maybe violent images or maybe erotic images, generating some sort of um, a bodily response that's intrinsic to almost everybody. Um, Seconds before such images are presented on screen, uh, the body seems to demonstrate some sort of physical precognition, like uh, a release of adrenaline, um, uh, opening of sweat glands, raising of blood pressure. These are what might be called the fight or flight mechanism, that these bodily effects are actually trackable um, moments prior to the exposure of whatever the triggering image is. So technologically, the field has advanced in many ways, of which that's only a small example. But I would say probably the greatest change that the field has experienced is a closer and closer convergence of conversation between people who really know what they're doing in quantum mechanics and people who are researching parapsychology. Because questions of string theory or the multiverse or many worlds, I think, provide a scent trail for where the field is going theoretically. And so in that sense, there have been very significant advances. J.B. Rhine, I think, to the frustration of those of us who love him as a scientist, as an intellect, as a historical figure, he never did much to theorize why any of this was happening, to theorize the mechanics of a conveyance mechanism. He didn't feel that that was his job. He felt that as a scientist, as a clinician, as a statistician, his job was to provide the data. And then others would come along and theorize the conveyance. Um, I think that that's happening. I mean, I believe JB could have done more, much as I love the man, could have done more to theorize a conveyance mechanism. But now I think we're on the brink of that those theories coming into maturity, coming into their own, and that's through, I think, from at least my perspective, I would say that's through the establishment of quantum mechanics over the past 90 years, which have done so much and are now doing so much in terms of these quantum computing models to expose us to a different understanding of our um, human and technological capacities.
Okay, I see people taking notes, so you have a lot that you can go home and study now. Are there any other questions that you might have? Well, I always have some, as I said. I'm curious about what you think is the biggest challenge for the field of parapsychology today.
That's a wonderful question. I want to try to answer that with freshness. What is the biggest challenge?
Where should we be putting our energy?
Well, some of my friends think um, that I am too attached to results coming out of the laboratory, that there are better examples of parapsychology in the field, so to speak. People, and these things can be proven through timestamps and other things. People may have a precognitive dream or glean information that's just impossible according to any known mechanism, and that passion needs to be involved. People need to have skin in the game, and that the results in the laboratory are too muted or too quiet. So there's a scholar of religion, a friend of mine, a mentor to me, Jeffrey Kripal, and Jeff feels that I am too attached to the lab model. And as he jokes, I need to spend less time in the German lab and more time in the Irish woods, and that there's more remarkable stuff to be found out in the field. And I'm not so sure I fully see it that way, because I think some of the experiments that like in precognition, for example, which I barely touched on, but experiments conducted by Darrell Bem at Cornell University, where he's a psychologist. Darrell did experiments into what is called retrocausality, a concept that is widely known and acknowledged within the quantum mechanics field. But his great innovation was he found a backwards causation effect in cognition. And specifically, he found, and this is going to blow your mind because it's simple and it's absolutely true. And as students, you'll all appreciate this. He found, in short, that if you study for an exam that you've already taken in the future, listen to me very carefully. If you study for an exam that you've already taken in the future, there is a backwards causative effect, a reaching backwards in time, so to speak, that facilitates a score by a few percentage points higher. Now, of course, this is greeted with howls of outrage. How can that possibly be? That's ridiculous. Reality doesn't work that way. Well, it very inconveniently for the skeptics does in fact work that way, because Darrell's experiments were validated in a meta-analysis consisting of 90 different experiments at 33 different labs in 14 different nations. That's better evidence than we have for whatever pharmaceuticals you might take tonight or that I take tonight. The numbers are bulletproof. But the acceptance, to speak to Sally's question, is lagging. And it's lagging, I think, because common observation is unbelievably persuasive and convincing, and we need it. We need common observation. If I agree that I'm going to give a talk at 5:45 p.m., I need to show up, or I'm inconveniencing everybody, and I'm creating problems for everybody. Linearity and a almost commonsensical ipso facto thinking is necessary for us five sensory beings to get through life. We'd be lost without it. It's a necessary illusion, but it's not ultimate reality. It's so conflicting with our experience of reality that it's very, very difficult to accept. So that psychological acceptance um, is a barrier that the field has always faced. And and the question of methodology, do we dedicate resources to the lab? Do we dedicate resources to the field? That's a question. Um, it need not be a question because you can thread two needles at once. It doesn't have to be either or. But sadly, because the pushback has been so culturally successful, resources are scarce. Even though these experiments are very inexpensive, resources are scarce. So the question of where to apply those resources is a difficult one.
Thank you. Now that's stimulating thought, isn't it? That you can change your own past.
Pretty wild, isn't it? And it's very hard for people to wrap their minds around, and understandably so, because it requires not thinking in terms of the arrow of time, which is what we're told exists in classical physics, but realizing that time seems to be multiple arrows, a spherical spiral of arrows, all happening at once. There was an episode of Better Call Saul, the miniseries, where the character of Walter White made a guest appearance, and the character of Saul said to him, if you could go back and do any of it over again, what would you do differently? And Walter's character got very upset and said to him, listen to me, don't talk to me about time travel. It's a practical and theoretical impossibility. If you want to talk to me about regrets, talk to me about regrets, but not time travel. Well, the writers, who I'm sure are very well informed, they're wrong. They're wrong. It's not a theoretical impossibility. In fact, it's a theoretical necessity. We already know that certain particles actually and effectively reverse charges and move backwards in time within the framework of particle physics. Whether this actually exists within the framework of cognition is, I think, that something that Darrell Bem provided a pioneering affirmative yes to, an affirmative yes that's been confirmed in a meta-analysis that took place a decade after his initial experiments. It's very hard to wrap our minds around this, but that's what real questions are. They're not supposed to be easy.
Hi, would you say that the greater barrier within the field is the validation of an experiment, the proof of that existence, or is it the explanation or the source of that proven existence?
So if I hear you right, is the question one of getting the data right, or of coming up with a reason why this data should exist?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I think that if we go back to the Zener cards that we have been speaking about in the class, that you can, and we had done it in practice in the class and had seen some of the experiments, and you can see, and I imagine if you spread out that data set to, a million, you could argue that the experiment is valid, that you see results.
Yeah.
But why do you see those results? That what is the source? What is what is the difference in a brain wave that creates that, or the air in the room, or the electricity in a room? That is it more difficult to validate the experiment and prove the existence of the theory, or the explanation behind why it is?
Well, the explanation behind why it is, I think, is going to be something that's going to occupy the next generation. I think coming up with a theory of ESP is critical. And maybe science over relies on theory, but we had, as a human community, we had fossil evidence of primeval animals, of earlier forms of hominid life, and none of it was able to be brought together really until Darwin's theory of evolution. Once Darwin proposed a compelling theory of of evolution, suddenly all this fossil evidence that had been around for decades became unified into one persuasive viewpoint. And I think that's what this field needs, it seems to me. The other thing is we've done, I think, some work finding correlates to ESP. When does it happen? What are the circumstances? Kind of like what you were just alluding to. And one of the things J.B. Rhine found back in the day, which I think has stood up very well, is that there needs to be an emotional investment. There needs to be skin in the game. It doesn't just happen. It's not like turning on and off a water faucet. The individual needs to feel some really deep commitment. And I think Daryl Bim and Dean Radin and others have reaffirmed that and demonstrated that in their experiments. Um, those who feel that lab work is useful only to a limited extent in parapsychology make the case rightly that you don't go to a laboratory for passion. Passion occurs out in the field where you might have a vision of somebody that you love in danger at a propitious moment, and then that vision turns out to be empirically correct and trackable and time stampable, and that's really where stuff starts to get wild. But I believe that feelings of enthusiasm, hopeful expectancy, comity, passion, sometimes negative passion like fear, fear for the well being of a loved one. These things need to be present for the results to really show up. So, those are some good correlates. Another correlate is, and I think this was demonstrated by a friend and now dead and a great researcher who worked with Sally named Charles Honorton, who was sort of a next generation from J.B. Rhine, but who had health problems and died very young. And losing Honorton was the equivalent of losing Einstein at the dawn of his relativity theories. But Honorton found that prime time for ESP, so to speak, is a state of very relaxed sensory deprivation, which is sometimes called hypnagogia. And this state is one that all of us enter naturally twice a day, just before we drift to sleep at night and just before we wake up and rouse ourselves in the morning. It's a state of very deep physical relaxation, almost bodily paralysis sometimes, uh, a state where we might experience hallucinatory or dreamy images, like the images from a Salvador Dali painting of clocks bending and so forth, but we still can control a cognition. And it's very valuable. It's very valuable, very interesting. It's a state that sleep researchers are dedicating increasing study to because it's a state that really falls somewhere between sleep and wakefulness. It's a very different state of being. And again, you feel it, you experience it, those moments of during those moments of exquisite relaxation just before you drift off to sleep and just before you come to in the morning. It's a time where the body is profoundly relaxed, where we're not experiencing a lot of sensory noise. We're not on our phones, we're not talking to other people, we're not getting overloaded with sensory data, and we're just about on the brink of a sleep state or coming out of a sleep state, and yet we can control cognition. So Honorton and his colleagues found that that seems to be prime time, so to speak, for ESP. And the numbers that he got in that state, he was specifically experimenting with telepathy, mind-to-mind communication. They surpassed even the numbers that J.B. Rhine got. So those are circumstances that seem to correlate with ESP if and when it occurs at all.
Thank you for that very thorough explanation. And we've talked about dream studies a little bit, and that adds to what we know. So, are there any other questions? Some of you have not had a chance to ask any. Would you like to?
I'd like to know if there's been, I'd like to know if there's been studies on near-death experience. I seem to hear more about it from professionals, rather than just people that it happens to, actually doctors and people who've experienced it through others.
Yes, that's a wonderful question. And there is a lot more being done in that area. And I think the question of near-death experiences, after-death experiences, is a booming growth area for the field. There is a parapsychologist now deceased, but his work continues, Ian Stevenson, and he founded a parapsychology lab at the University of Virginia. There's a man named Jim Tucker who continues to run that lab. And Stevenson was specifically interested in the question of reincarnation, and he correlated thousands and thousands of cases of possible potential reincarnation, finding extraordinary congruencies between children who were experiencing trauma and other people nearby or sometimes not so nearby who had died violent deaths and who bore uncanny resemblances to these children. Sometimes, for example, the child might have a birthmark on his or her body that correlated directly to the entry and exit wound of a bullet, for example, on someone who died who spoke a different language that this child had never learned, but suddenly one day demonstrates fluency in. So that was incredible. And that data has stood up remarkably well. And it's world-class data. It's bulletproof data, so to speak. Others are more and more studying questions of near-death experiences and consciousness that very clearly and demonstrably continues after episodes of physical death. Um, Very controversial, but the body of data is growing and growing, and it's snowballing. It's building in such a way that I think that's the next among the next great frontiers for the field.
Well, I've been putting some names you've been mentioning on the board so that students can do further reading on their own. Are there any other last questions that we might have for Mitch, who has done such an outstanding job of sharing what he knows with us? I always have one, so, I'll ask mine now, okay? This is one that I get asked sometimes. It's the so what question. Like, okay, what if all of this is true? So how does that mean, you live your life any differently? Don't you just live the same life that you lived before?
Right.
I know how I answer it. Maybe you have a different answer. So why don't you go ahead?
I would say that the so what question is very important. I mean, obviously, I can make flowery statements about humanity needing to know the nature of reality, it being basic to the human situation to want to know what's around the next corner. And of course, all of that is true. I do believe that as we human beings come to understand ourselves as more than just creatures of flesh and bone, motor cognition, um, and people who go through life maybe like little rubber duckies adrift on a disruptive sea. I think this material gives the individual a sense of greater tools, greater options, greater possibilities in life. You're more than what you've been raised to believe that you are, which doesn't mean there aren't very severe countervailing forces. We live under multiple laws and forces. Let's say everything I've described is true. It doesn't mean that it's all ever operative in this way that turn you into Neo from the Matrix. Natural laws are conditioned by other natural laws. We all know gravity, whatever that may be. It seems to be mass attracted to itself. We all know gravity is a natural law, but gravity is, as I was just alluding, affected by mass. It's ever operative, but you're going to experience it differently here on Earth than you would on Jupiter. Weather fronts are natural laws. Earthquakes are natural laws. They produce seismic effects, but they're counteracted, they're countervailed by other natural laws. So I'm not saying that the existential dilemma of human beings is going to be solved tomorrow, but it does help the individual to understand that he or she is not just in pieces and at the mercy of whatever environmental factor happens to come along, but there are other factors, there are greater possibilities. Um, Retrocausality alone, as I've been describing it, teaches that to us. The past is not this fixed thing that we can only have regrets about. Well, with apologies to Walter White, in fact, there does appear to be a cognitive retrocausal effect, and we're just at the very beginning of understanding this. We're like on our knees, peeking through a keyhole, just seeing so much. And to experiment with these possibilities, I think broadens our definition of what it means to be human. And so many people today are depressed, they're anxious. We feel a sense of exhaustion, and I think we feel some of these things collectively because this aspect of our human nature has not been understood, and it's time. It's time. I think we've been perched on this breakthrough for close to a century, and it's time to cross this threshold reasonably, maturely, intelligently, in an evidence-based way. But what I described, to the best of my capacity, is real, and it says something about the expanded possibilities of human nature.
Well, this has been amazing, and thank you for letting us cross this bridge with you that you've been describing. If they were to read one of your books, which one would you recommend deals with most of what you've been talking about?
Well, it's a toss-up. I have a book called Daydream Believer, and in Daydream Believer is a chapter called The Parapsychology Revolution. I have another book called Modern Occultism, which is a history of the occult from late antiquity to today. In that book is a chapter called Science of the Supernatural, which is probably a little more complete than what's in Daydream Believer. So either of those are good bets. I provide lots of reference sources in those books, as I do in all of my articles. Test my references. Put my feet to the fire. Hold me to the test. If you think I'm wrong about something, reach out to me. My website is mitchhorowitz.com. It hooks up to my email. It's my real email, not one of these fake email accounts that nobody checks. And if I get something wrong or if I've exaggerated, put my feet to the fire. I really want you to hold me to it because I provide this material with a full complement of reference sources because I want people to determine for themselves um, whether I'm stating all this um, with plainness and truthfulness without exaggeration. Shame on me if I am exaggerating, and hold me to it.
Well, the field is very lucky to have you as an advocate, and we thank you for being here with us. Thank you.
A pleasure. I really appreciate it.
Till next time. Thank
Okay.
you.
See you again. Okay. Good night, everyone.
Good night.